Hi, this is Jeffrey Tucker of Brownstone Institute. I'm very happy to be here with Gabrielle Bauer, the author of Blindsight Is 2020. And congratulations, Gabrielle. It's finally done. It's finally out, and it's selling really well.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here, too. And very happy for Brownstone support.
Well, it was a long time coming. I mean, you worked on the book for a better part of a year, and now here it is. You know, step by step. Suddenly, here we are now with the book available on Amazon. And we're going to make it available on other things too, Barnes and Noble and Apple and all these various things. But for now, we're just at Amazon. So all the people complaining that they hate Amazon, okay, fine. We'll get there. We'll get there. Now, one of the things that we've been running some excerpts on Brownstone, of course, and everybody says, "Wow, this is beautifully written." Of course, that's why we published it. It's beautifully written. What do you see as being the main? Well, what do you think is the main value of the book?
I think I've read quite a few pandemic books, and a lot of them focus on either the science or the politics of, the pandemic response, what happened. And there's a third bucket, which I call the sociology of the pandemic response, which is how people responded, why the world went nuts. And when I say people, I include scientists and politicians and the public. And my book really focuses on that slice. I mean, obviously, the three buckets are interconnected, the science, the politics, and the sociology. But that's the slant of the book. It goes beyond, the science and the political machinations.
Right. And so it's not really didactic. It's not like, oh, here's my position, here's all the evidence, here's my charts and graphs and numbers and proof and citations of studies. It's more of a sort of a humanistic examination of the people and the personalities who were really dissidents from the very start.
Yes, and their arguments. The arguments saying, wait a minute, this went too far. We crossed some lines here, and this is why. So I consider it philosophical, ethical, as you say, humanistic examination.
Yeah. Well, what's fascinating about this is that these days, you certainly get the sense that everybody's coming around to saying something like, oh, that was dumb, that was botched, that was a mess. But, here it is, essentially 3 years later. And it would have been sort of nice to have seen this level of incredulity in the beginning. But a lot of the people that you chronicle, and I think there's like 46 people you go into some detail about, faced a lot of pushback, right?
Pushback is putting it mildly. I mean, they were crucified, and I had a microcosm of that as well. When I attempted to share some of my thoughts online, I also got crucified. We all know the drill. What anyone who expressed a dissident opinion faced. We were accused of being sociopaths, eugenicists. I mean, the vilest kind of terms. And this completely precluded any civilized adult discussion about the issues. And yes, just about everyone that I interviewed and feature in the book faced this kind of thing.
And each one has a story to tell about their own sort of doubts and then their willingness to kind of speak out and that sort of thing.
I mean, there's some very tragic stories. Some people are still not speaking to other family members and friends and so forth. I was lucky in that I haven't lost any personal connections, including with my colleagues and clients, but I certainly got my share of it online.
Yeah, by online, you mean mainly on Facebook or?
Facebook and Reddit, and I wasn't on Twitter until fairly recently, but now on Twitter too. Yeah.
Yeah, and this was. Do you ever wonder about this? Like, on one hand, you have this sociological element that it seemed obvious what kind of position you were supposed to take, and to be a dissident meant sort of really looking, extremely carefully and using a lot of critical thinking skills that we're not used to using. On the other hand, there was a great sort of top-down effort, even from the early days, to kind of suppress dissent. So it worked from both ends, right? You had sort of a populist fear working together with algorithms that were really had preordained conclusions and therefore excluding people who were not part of that.
Absolutely. And I think the other sort of human impulse that asserted itself was this groupthink, what Matthias Desmet, who I feature in the book, calls mass formation. It's a term that some people may not be familiar with, but really it's nothing more than mob psychology. And we saw that in spades. And then I think the fear kind of lit the match, and then the mass formation, the group psychology kept it going. And then we had the third impulse, which is the impulse to control other people, that began asserting itself. And I think it's those three ingredients that just kept the whole narrative going.
Have you thought much about this? Like how is it that a fear of infectious disease seemed to trigger this sort of nightmare for us?
That's a good question. I wonder if it's baked into our DNA somehow, because it's part of the human history. We have co-evolved with viruses and other pathogens, and we have seen the kind of destruction that they can wreak. So I think perhaps it's somehow built into the human psyche. But again, it was allowed to fester and grow without any calming influence. The government and the media is supposed to have some kind of a calming influence on all this to reassure people. And in this case, it did exactly the opposite. It just fomented the fears.
Right. And I would say more than anything else, that was for me the biggest shock, because for the better part of a century, we had public health, meaning, the officials and everybody in the scientific establishment, so united with the media to really avoid these kind of disease panics. I mean, there was a specific attempt in the past, whether it's 68, 69, 57, 58, even, certainly then, but going all the way back to not trigger these kinds of panics. And yet in late February is my memory, of 2020, it went the opposite way. They just kind of repudiated this whole previously deployed sort of calming voice and decided to go the opposite way.
Yeah, it's quite astonishing when you think about it. As you said, if you look at any pre-COVID pandemic guidance, whether from the WHO, the CDC, the NHS, they always make a point of recommending the maintenance of calm, and that public health has a role in that. And why they abdicated that completely? I mean, I'm not the first one to observe that social media may have had something to do with it. Social media just amplifying certain fears. And then I think there's also the whole zeitgeist of a certain kind of moral alarmism at everything. There's this tendency for people to get outraged that I think is greater than it used to be. And I think that captured a lot of the media and the politicians as well. And the media is also supposed to push back against government. That's one of its roles. And there was none of that, except in all these underground channels. It was quite remarkable.
I guess we all have our own stories. What is your story looking back at the day when you realized that, I guess you could say, that everything had changed?
Well, for me, that was day one. That was actually day one.
What is day one for you? Because I mean, this like day one is, for me, it's somewhere between the middle of January and the middle of March 2020.
So you're even earlier than I was. No, for me, day one was the day that the lockdowns were announced. I was actually in Brazil at the time, and visiting some friends, and I had to come home early because of the pandemic. So that was a big complication. I had to book new tickets and all that. But I remember thinking, literally, when I found out about the lockdowns, why are there only scientists being consulted here? Where are the economists and the historians and the mental health experts and the ethicists, where are they? Why are we not talking to them? It was just the scientists, listen to the science. And that made no sense to me, because managing a pandemic is not just a scientific problem, it's a human problem. It's how do we shepherd the human family through a challenging event? And there's so many considerations that go beyond control of a virus. And I think I and people like me had these concerns. So from the start, the whole approach and the lockdown strategy, uncontested, just made no sense to me, and that we were not allowed to discuss it.
And it wasn't scientists in general. That's what they always said. The scientific consensus says you have to do the following thing, but it was only a narrow slice of scientists, right? I mean, I've always puzzled about this. Mm-hmm. Of course, I'm very aware. We should be clear that you're in Canada, right? So,
yeah.
In the U.S. case, I mean, it's literally the case that Trump just had access to just a handful of people. When the decision was made. I mean, it was Fauci and Birx and then son-in-law and his two friends and Scott Gottlieb on the other end. I mean, as far as we know, that was pretty much it. I mean, it's just a tiny slice. I mean, amazing.
Right. And anyone who dissented was declared invalid, fringe, or whatever. So that was one way to manufacture consensus.
Right. You might maybe just take a few minutes and lay out what you think are some of the more interesting sort of stories in the book about the dissident voices. And I should be clear before we do that as you recall, and which, by the way, I'm getting a lot of correspondence from people saying, how come I wasn't included in the book? But that's inevitable, right? I mean,
well, we can touch on that. I think it's important for me to touch on that, in that there's so many people that I admire and that have done great work. Mm-hmm. And there is no way I could include them all. And the fact that someone was included or wasn't included really has no bearing on their stature or anything like that. I had to make some choices based on the objectives of the book, which were to look not primarily at scientific issues, although of course I do, but primarily at sociological, philosophical, ethical issues, and also to have a balance of political perspectives, because the book ranges from far left to far right in terms of political affiliations of the people featured, and also in terms of disciplines. I needed to include some scientists, some doctors, but also some philosophers, ethicists, economists, lawyers, writers, quite a few writers, and even a comedian and a priest. So there was just no way in a book of reasonable length that I could include everyone. So there was, I had this goal of balancing things. So that's
it's
my
actually
message.
Interesting, Gabrielle, because I've, you can't communicate everything at once, but it's funny to me that I've gotten several messages that somehow the book was representative of the voices and intellectuals who are most important to Brownstone Institute. And I had to, I've had to, which is a funny. It's like, no, we're just the publisher, right? This was wholly and completely your book. And in fact, when we first started talking about it, that was the first point that we talked about. I just made it really clear to you that your choices were your choices, and that I was going to have no influence over what you decided to do.
Yeah, and I really respected that. And I even asked you, I said, if you want to give me some ideas, I'm perfectly open to them. And I did incorporate some of your ideas, but even so, you gave me complete latitude in making the selection. And one more thing I should add, the selection also reflects the people who inspired me personally and who I got to know personally. I got to know some of them on Zoom and in person. And so, yes, of course, it's a personal selection too.
Yeah. Well, and I really respect that in a way, because, if you get burdened down by a sense of, oh, I can't omit this person, or I have to include this person. I mean, this is the kind of project that would never be finished. It would be, 150 volumes, and
yes.
And that's just right. And it's just crazy. And we wanted to, the book had to be written as a beautiful narrative, which it is, and with all the diversity, and you made the choices. I thought we had a pretty good thing going here, and I think the readers have been very impressed so far. So anyway, let's jump right into. Do you want to name some names? And we've already ran your tribute to Laura Dodsworth, which is just a great chapter.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, she actually found me on Twitter after that, and she thanked me. So that was nice. Yeah.
And her book "State of Fear" was pretty early on. Right?
Yes, that was the first book that I read about the pandemic in 2021, and I was so relieved. It was like I didn't feel as alone. Somebody who shared a lot of my thoughts about the fear is just out of proportion. The response is out of proportion. And this is one of the points that I also keep coming back to. Whenever you say something like this, that this is out of proportion, people will say, oh, so you think COVID is a hoax or something? No, you can think that a real threat exists and the response is disproportionate. Those two things can coexist. But it's amazing how often when you give any kind of pushback to the narrative, people will say, oh, so you don't think COVID is real?
That happened all the time in my interactions,
Absolutely.
Some of the strangest phrases were being manufactured just out of nowhere. Like for a while, I was widely called a COVID minimizer. Do you remember that term?
How can we forget? I have a good a counter term for that, which is a COVID maximizer, which we sometimes use in our circles because that's what it is. And I think I make the point in the book, too, that the risks of alarmism are real. People talk about the risks of minimizing, but there are also risks involved in exaggerating a threat, huge societal risks.
Well, who are some of the other figures that you want to mention in particular out of the 46?
Oh, gosh, where do I start? Well, Matthias Desmet was a great one because he really captured this whole idea of groupthink and brought it into the public discourse. Vinay Prasad is another one. Since I joined Twitter, that guy never sleeps. He never stops. There isn't an hour that he isn't tweeting something. And he somehow manages to write articles and research papers and see patients, presumably. Yeah. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
Yeah. And it's funny to watch his evolution. He's become bolder and brasher over the months and years, and he really just says what he thinks now, which is great. Even including some nice swear words, which I allude to in the book as well. I really liked Z-Dog as well, Zubin Damania. I know that, people have different opinions about him. I found that he had a great spiritual dimension and detachment where he was really able to see both sides, and bring that perspective and understand that humans have different worldviews and different dominant moral levers. And so I spoke with him personally. I interviewed him, and I really appreciated that because I think sometimes we do get locked in our own perspectives, including supposedly our side. And it's good to just have a reminder and to, pull back a bit and reflect on the fact that other people come with their own baggage as we do.
Right. And whom else do you want to mention?
Whom else? Oh, some writers. I really enjoyed researching and writing about Matthew Crawford and Lionel Shriver. For those who don't know Lionel Shriver, it's a woman, the author of We Need to Talk About Kevin. And such refreshing perspectives that they bring. Lionel Shriver just talks about the complete abdication of freedoms and civil rights as though they just ceased to exist. And that's an important theme in the book, which is what happens to civil rights, human rights during a pandemic? Do we just set them aside, or do we somehow find a way to incorporate them? Are they important? If they're important at all, are they important during a pandemic? And that's one of the things that she really brings out. And Matthew Crawford's a really interesting guy because he's a philosopher and a writer, but he's also a mechanic. And so he brings that refreshing, concrete perspective to the debate. And he observed, as I have as well, that often, I don't like to generalize, but I have observed this, that people in the trades have a much more sanguine, and proportionate attitude towards things COVID. They didn't freak out the way the so-called laptop class did. And I really found that to be true when I think of the workers who came into our house to do repairs or whatever. I talked to them about this stuff, and they just had this lovely reality-based perspective that was very hard to find in the middle classes.
And yet, it was the workers and the actual, not the Zoomers, that were thrown in front of the virus from the very beginning. It was this sort of extreme class-based response.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and that was one of my issues again from day one. I thought, what about the young and the poor, or the working people, or the business owners? That was an immediate response. I thought this lockdown response is just throwing them under the bus. Yeah. And, what happened to first do no harm.
I'm not even sure I understood what's now perfectly obvious to me, which is that the public life and the intellectual narrative surrounding public life is largely the creation of a ruling class, and it's managed by the ruling class for the ruling class. I don't. That's so obvious to me now, but before the COVID period, I'm not sure I fully realized that. I mean, I'll just one example with the New York Times, who were always telling people for 2 years, stay home and get your groceries delivered. I mean, it's just, if you think about that, that's a funny, a funny thing to say.
Exactly. Get them delivered by who exactly?
Not readers of the New York Times.
Yeah, and that's right. That's right. That's right.
No journalists of the New York Times are delivering groceries to anybody. So,
yeah. No, exactly. And not only that, but somebody that I think I quote in the book mentioned that the policies also reflect middle-aged or upper middle-aged concerns, not even necessarily the concerns of the elderly, because a lot of elderly people didn't want that, people that I talked to and people that I read about. But it's the concerns of maybe the younger boomers or the older millennials, and it doesn't reflect the concerns of the young or the very old.
Right.
So
I wonder, we could speculate on why that is. So, I noticed this, at least in the world I saw, that the most intense fears were concentrated among the sort of 20-somethings. I'm not sure if you saw that.
Kids. No, I know. Not my kids. They're both 20-somethings, but no, they were pretty much on board with me from the start, which was nice. My husband took a longer to come around, but he's on board now. At the beginning, he was the guy wiping all the groceries.
It was a funny one. But the people I noticed who were least concerned were the people who were above 75 cohort. They're like the elderly. But I've wondered if that was just simply due to, a lifetime of wisdom. That's good. But a particular kind of wisdom, that this was a generation that was very well schooled in viruses and cell biology and immunology and all these things when they were young. And this is the chicken poxers, who got variolated to measles and chickenpox, and so they didn't otherize disease in the way so many younger people do. What do you think about that theory?
Well, it's an interesting theory. I hadn't actually heard about it or thought about it before. My perspective was a little bit simpler in that these are people who have lived most of their lives, and what they really want from the remaining years and months, is to connect with people and stay connected with the people they love. So, policies that make that impossible probably didn't make as much sense to them. And plus, a lot of them are lonely and isolated to begin with. So this just made it worse.
Right.
But that's an interesting perspective that you mentioned. I'll have to think about that more.
Well, of course, I'm speaking, about my mother in particular, because she was just very early on. She said, "Don't worry about it. The virus will circulate. We'll get herd immunity, then we'll get together again." I mean, so she had a very calm sort of outlook, and she's like 83, So now. There was in the beginning far fewer dissidents, but they gradually developed over I can't believe we're talking about this actually.
I know, 3 years. Yeah.
Over 6 months, which is a very long time, by the way, to stay in lockdown. I mean, it's just outrageous what was happening between.
Well, we had it a lot worse in Ontario than you had it in the States. I mean, we had successive lockdowns, including a brutal one of several months, from later 2021 to 2022 in February. So it was pretty brutal.
Yeah,
and we had curfews in Quebec and all kinds of stuff like that.
Now, out of all the people you interviewed for the book, when was there a moment in which most of these, because not everybody was on board, was right from the beginning, as they say, right? I mean, so was there a moment where most of the people that you interview and talk to said, okay, that's enough? Was there some trigger in the news that made them think, wait, something's not right here? Or was it just a kind of a gradual unfolding, cascading over time?
I think there were some who, like me, like us, recoiled against the policies right from the start. But I think that there was a consensus among several others that around May of 2020, May or June, is when we started to see that places like Sweden, for instance, and then just a bit later, Florida, were not really doing all that differently from the places that had, lockdowns of various degrees of severity. And that's when people really started to question, how much difference is this making? So I think that that's when people's minds started to open up a bit. And in fact, I remember in the summer of 2020, there were several countries in which groups of experts, doctors and scientists got together and wrote open letters to their governments. I think in Belgium and Austria, I can't remember all the countries, in the UK, I think in Israel as well, wrote letters to their open government saying, wait a minute, you've gone too far, you've crossed a line. And I was happy to see all those letters and dismayed to find out that they made no difference. That was the odd thing.
Yeah, I'm so grateful that you mentioned this, actually, because I am afraid that this has been forgotten. But there were many, many groups in many countries and many scientists that were speaking out from the summer on, and probably quite earlier than that, even from April, that were making these statements and these protests. So that is very important. I mean, as important as I think the Great Barrington Declaration is, and you talk about that in some detail in here, and those behind it, there were many other statements that preceded that. Yes.
And it is interesting that the Great Barrington Declaration is the one that actually did penetrate through the social membrane. And it's hard to assess exactly how it influenced policy, but I think it did. And that's the one that captured the world's attention, which is great. It got a lot of pushback, as we all know, but at least it got people's attention. And yes, all those previous ones, the governments just ignored.
Mm-hmm. And they also didn't have. They had a very weak technological system for distribution. And so there was this common. Again, it goes back to this problem of sort of top-down censorship, but also people were not really ready for those statements yet.
Yeah, it seemed like this machinery had been set in motion, and this machinery of false consensus and it was very difficult to break through it.
Now, Gabrielle, as you're putting the book together and writing the book, and you are an experienced medical journalist and journalist of all things, so the prose is elegant, and it's a luxury really to read, and well written, and that old sort of sense in which that's true. I mean, there's so much writing now, you can't read it all, but it's rare that you encounter somebody that's just really elegant and a pleasure to read. So that's your book. But when you're writing, did you have an audience in mind? Like, as you put the book together, did you have somebody, like a mythical figure out there who you're or a real person who you're really trying to sort of write for and to?
Yes, I did, for sure. I mean, I had two audiences. I had people who naturally empathized with our position and felt the same way. And people like that can read a book like mine and hopefully find some support and validation. There's all these other people who feel the same way. Oh, I wasn't crazy. There's all these illustrious thinkers who feel the same way. And at the same time, I also wrote the book for the other side. That was very clear objective. I mean, I don't like to separate people into two sides because obviously there are nuances, but I did write the book for the people who wholeheartedly supported the lockdowns and all the mandates that followed. Because I have found some books about the pandemic, are maybe so much defending our side that it might be a little bit difficult to reach the other side. So I thought, okay, I'm going to at least try to reach the other side and present some of the arguments, not necessarily to get them to agree, but to understand a little bit more and maybe to reflect a little bit. So that was one of my objectives. And the person who reviewed the manuscript, I asked her to think from the perspective of someone from the other side when reviewing it. And
right. It occurs to me as you say this, Gabrielle, that one of the problems with these books that are that start with the presumption that this is all a gigantic sort of a plot and scheme from the top, with Bill Gates and the World Economic Forum secretly pulling all the strings, rapaciously pillaging the world to try to put microchips in our skulls and under our skin. So whatever the thing is, that perspective, even if it's true,
right.
But I mean, listen, it leaves out the fact that there was a huge populist movement that supported this whole thing. And many, many good thinkers and good people got sort of swept up in this in ways that are, I would say, like highly regrettable and are now trying to figure out, like, why did I do that? Why was I part of that? And here's why
some still cling to the idea that they did the right thing. So.
Right. And so your book is kind of valuable for them too, just to kind of see the rationale, I mean, the thought processes that went into sort of doubting the prevailing narratives.
Exactly. I want to sort of demystify the skeptical side and skeptical thinking. So that was definitely an important objective, to somehow try to connect with the other side.
And this also serves as a kind of, like, I don't know how else to put it, but as sort of a therapeutic purposes, right? When you've been through something as calamitous and chaotic and nutty as the last 3 years, there is a kind of a human need to sort of come to terms with what happened, and to reset your mental and psychological framework around it.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it is, I don't like to use the word trauma too lightly, but I think it was a trauma psychologically, even if we were not materially affected. I have to say I was not materially affected because I've worked from home for the past 28 years. So I just continued doing the same thing I was always doing. And, my home life, fortunately is fine. Nothing was affected, but it was traumatic for me. just the sense of powerlessness that this was happening in the world. And I couldn't express my dismay at it. There was nothing I could do about it. And it was just happening all around me. There was, I remember one day, I think it was May 4th, I'll never forget, where I woke up in the morning and I felt so powerless and enraged. I called my adult daughter up, and I was just like sobbing uncontrollably because it just seemed like the world was getting away from us and we couldn't do anything. And I think we all experienced that in one way or another.
It's so true, isn't it? So true. I was feeling that way from March on, and it was terrible for me personally because it meant sort of replacing the story of life in my head, which was one of unrelenting progress towards ever more emancipation of the human family. That's the kind of nonsense I've been carried around in my head for a very long time. And so when the Hegelian story of history sort of suddenly shifted, it was a personal trauma for me just to deal with the reality of what was happening, all around us. And I remember getting phone calls back in those days from people with whom I'm very close, just saying things to me like, something's really wrong. Like something's wrong with me. Something's wrong with everything. Do you have a minute to talk? Kind of feeling. I think this is widely shared.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think that's why there's going to be pandemic books, and there's room for lots of pandemic books for quite some time to come, because each book brings a different perspective, and it was a global event more than just about any other event in history. And there's a lot of processing to do. And as I said earlier, some people are going to look more at the science, where we went wrong scientifically. Other people are going to look more at, the politically, what happened behind the scenes. And then there's people like me who are going to look more at the philosophy and the sociology and the ethics of it.
Now, so it strikes me that one of the lessons that you take from the book is that we need to think independently, that we need to be a little bit incredulous towards prevailing media narratives, and when all the experts are screaming one thing that doesn't quite fit with your intuition, you should maybe dig a little deeper and ask more fundamental questions. Is that the lesson you take from your studies in your book?
That is definitely one of them. Yes, think for yourself. This idea that we're supposed to outsource our thinking, which really gained prominence in the pandemic. I remember there was articles about literally saying you should not think for yourself. You should let the experts do it, which is absurd. But then the other idea I think that I'm promoting, that the book really promotes, is that we need multidisciplinary and open debates. We absolutely need to have debates between people of various disciplines, such as the people showcased in the book. And these debates have to reach people's living rooms through various media channels.
It's funny. Your comment there just reminds me of something. The pandemic highlighted the dangers of over specialization in many ways. Like it was a time of credentialism. Like we have a pandemic, there's a virus loose. The only people who can speak on this are the people with letters after the name and peer-reviewed publications and experts on viruses. And so,
which is absurd.
Why is that absurd?
Well, it comes back to what I said at the beginning. A pandemic is not just a problem of virology, of epidemiology. It's a problem of how to manage humans in a crisis. And in fact, one of the people featured in the book, Mark Woolhouse, who is an epidemiologist who was part of the Scottish pandemic response, he says in his book called The Year the World Went Mad, he says that pandemic management was left too much to epidemiologists, which was great and very refreshing to hear. And there are other scientists who have who are big enough to say the same thing. that no, it's not just something to be left to epidemiologists.
This happened in the White House, for example. They, Fauci and Birx really tried to surround Trump with just people that they regarded as being like experts in virology and pharmacology, kinds of things. And they were desperate to keep the economists, away.
Out of it.
Out of it. It's like, well, those economists that are all concerned about the stock market, of course, but we know that really doesn't really matter.
Yeah. A complete misunderstanding of what the economy is, isn't it? That whole artificial straw man that was set up, lives versus the economy.
Right.
Sure.
And then it also speaks to the issue of the artists, right? I mean, I was disappointed that the artists didn't really spring up to that. Was the art was really the very first casualty of this whole thing. I remember it was like March 11th or 12th being in New York City, and right on the day that Broadway closed, and all these people were sitting around a bar that had just been made unemployed, and
yeah, I think that was a big disappointment to many of us, how little pushback there was from the arts, how they just got sucked right in, and they weren't speaking up for, the importance, the importance for the human soul, for human connection of the arts. That was a big disappointment for me. And that is why I feature some people in the book, some musicians, 3 musicians, and some artists and a comedian who did speak out and go, hey, wait a minute. These things matter. They matter in a fundamental way. And we can't just jettison them without any discussion.
Well, and it was similarly and implausibly true for religion, too. I mean, it's which is just something astounding that, that we would, for 2 successive Easters in this country, kept the churches closed. I mean...
Yeah, and it was interesting for me because I'm not a religious person myself, but I think that during the pandemic, I felt more empathy and solidarity with religious people than I ever had before, because I really understood. I came to understand because of, my reading and discussions with people that religion is for some people what arts and culture is to others, and it's a way to connect with people and with life. And again, you can't just brush it aside. So I found that a very interesting personal evolution. And I talk about it in the book, and I feature one priest in the book as well, even though my background is Jewish.
You know that I've heard this from so many people that have been newly drawn to communities of faith because they saw that, first of all, they're uniquely victimized by the COVID response, but also because that it seemed to be these pockets of religion that were the most reluctant to sort of go along with the mass hysteria and comply with it. So you have the Hasidim and the Amish and then the Mormons and later the evangelicals, and so on, that really kind of kept their heads in when the whole world was going nuts, right?
Yes, and I think that led me to understand them and respect them more. I have a mostly Jewish background. My mother was raised Orthodox, but I was not. My father was half Jewish, but then my mother kind of returned to her roots later in life. But I always thought of the Orthodox community as a little bit, alien and different. I really didn't have much connection with them. But then during the pandemic, when I was reading about the reaction, I felt so much empathy for them. And I talk about that during the book too. I really understood where they were coming from. They thought it was important to keep their kids in school because they thought school and Torah is protective. And, they went out and said it. And
the rituals that govern their lives are rituals that govern their lives for a reason. It's because they continue to practice them regardless of the circumstances, war or economic depression or pandemic or anything. They're rituals because they adhere to because they're sort of the foundation of the community life and people's faith. And
exactly.
they weren't give them up.
Yes, it's not just, these things are not just for fair weather times. That's the whole point. Things like, freedom and community and religion and culture, they are not just for fair weather times. If they matter at all, they matter all the time, which doesn't mean that you can't flex at all, that you have to keep things exactly the same, but you still have to fold these things into the strategy and into the discussion.
Now, the focus of your book is, would you say, I was just tweeted this out yesterday. I think one interesting way to look at the pandemic period is that there were really three tests of compliance. I mean, first there was the lockdowns, and then there were the mask mandates, and then later the vaccine mandates, right? So there's like three big buckets in a way. And very few people made it through all three by going, I'm not going along with this, right? At some point, almost everybody bought in. But your book is largely focused on the lockdown bucket, right?
It does have, it does touch on the masks for sure, several people, and the vaccines, but I don't get into the science of the vaccine so much, the side effects, the efficacy and all that, because that's continually changing. But I do get into the ethics of the mandates.
Right.
There is one chapter in particular that features Julie Ponesi and Aaron Cariati, and it lays out the ethical issues. And there's actually another chapter that I can think of, another bioethicist I spoke with, an Australian who's featured in the book, Zeb Jamerzik. And these three people who I talked to and interviewed, they actually shaped my own views. I started out I didn't start out outraged by the vaccine mandates. I thought, well, it's not that different from the school mandates for children. But then my own views evolved as the pandemic wore on. And, as we saw some clinical disappointments with the vaccines, the big one being that they don't stop transmission. And then speaking to these ethicists, I realized more. I came to really understand the ethical complexities and problems with those mandates. I mean, sure, there was mandates for other vaccines, but they were much easier to get out of. People's jobs and livelihoods and social standing didn't depend on them. You could get out of the mandates by paying a fine or by citing a religious exemption or, so the mandates were they functioned more as a social opt-in. Okay, this is our, baseline. And if you want to opt out, you have to go through some steps. But there wasn't this degree of, that people's whole lives, social and professional lives, depended on following the mandates.
Jabber job, yeah, unbelievable.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
We've never seen anything like this. I mean, I don't know. I was thinking this morning that it compares to like conscription or something like that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And also the social ostracism. I don't know if you saw that Toronto Star front page. There was one day in 2021 where there was a whole front page of the Toronto Star with quotes from people saying horrible things about people who didn't get the vaccine. Like they all deserve to die. I mean, really, really, really extreme stuff. And the whole front page was just that.
Astounding.
And the Toronto Star is a very progressive newspaper, so it was quite astonishing.
Yeah, what a time and what a thing we've lived through. I'm so grateful for your book. It's not I would say a long book, right? I mean, I think it comes in at about 300 pages, something like that.
Yeah, it's not long and it's not short. So.
Right, but it's a pleasure to read. So it's not an angry book. It's it's balanced and with focus on accuracy, with a humane feeling and really luxurious prose. I think anybody would benefit from reading it. And fortunately, you've mentioned some of the people, 46 of thousands,
yes,
who deserve some recognition, some discussion. And this is not just about hagiography for the great heroes. This is an attempt to explain how it is that they arrived at their positions and what their positions were as being COVID dissidents. So
exactly, yes, yeah.
Well, Gabrielle, I guess we'll leave it there. I'm so grateful to you. And as I say, I've been very impressed at the sales, just like, just right out of the box. It's just been wonderful. But I have a feeling that this book is going to really do well by virtue of the word of mouth. I think people are really going to enjoy reading it and passing it on to their friends. So just thank you for all the beautiful work you did on it. And
thank you to Brownstone for collaborating with me. It's been great.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle. All the best.
Bye.